what's the best way for people to combat the negative influence of right-wing media like Fox, InfoWars, Red State, The Drudge Report, and all the rest?
To support stations like KGNU. That was an easy one. You planned it that way.
I'm saving the easy questions for the end. How to achieve a break with the dominant capitalist paradigm?
How
to achieve a break?
How to achieve a break?
Economic order.
Well, there's only one way to do it. A large mass of the population must come to recognize that the system is too resistant to efforts to reform and improve it, to allow further such efforts to persist and then move to further actions. We're very far from that. There's plenty of room for very significant reform. In fact, as some of the quotes I gave earlier indicate, if we were to go back to Eisenhower conservatism, it would be a big step forward, a big step forward. I remember those were the years of what's sometimes called regimented capitalism. The New Deal regulations were still imposed. Banks were banks, no financial crises, no massive speculation and predatory institutions. It was the fastest growth period in American history, egalitarian growth. The lowest quintile did as good as the highest. There was plenty wrong with it, plenty of horrible things, but by contemporary standards, it had severe defects, like the achievements of the 1960s hadn't yet taken place, but in socioeconomic terms, it was improved. That's why you have sentiments like Eisenhower's, and we can certainly go far beyond that. There are ways to erode the capitalist structure from within, and they're being undertaken. So one important series of developments is the spread of the very large-scale spread of cooperatives, worker-owned enterprises, localism, and food supply, many other initiatives of this kind, which sort of build the institutions of a fairer, more free society within the present one. And that could continue. How far it can continue, we don't know. But such efforts have to be pushed to their limits. And again, it's only when a great mass of the population recognizes that the limits can go no further that you can anticipate constructive, substantial, even revolutionary change.
Antonio Gramsci, the great Italian Marxist philosopher who died in 1937, he talked about morbid symptoms arising as civilizations are decline. I'd like you to talk about that, and also his famous adage of pessimism of the intellect and optimism of the will.
Yeah, that's Antonio Gramsci. From his, he was sentenced to prison in order, as the prosecutor said, openly, in order to silence his voice. Became one of the leading political prisoners from the 1920s. Incidentally, that's just happened again in Brazil, where the most popular candidate, Lula, as he's known by everyone, who was set to win the election, was sentenced to what amounts to life imprisonment and solitary confinement, banned from receiving any public information, and crucially banned from making any public statement. This was right before the election, which he was set to win. The alleged crimes, whatever you think about them, are so utterly disproportionate from the nature of the sentence that it's creating a political prisoner, which is very reminiscent of Gramsci, in order to silence this voice forever. And in prison, Gramsci in the early 30s did talk about what he said is that the old order is collapsing and the new order has not yet arisen. And in this interregnum, there are many morbid symptoms, and that looks familiar. The old order is collapsing. All through Europe, every election, the centrist political institutions are declining, eroding. New forces are developing, unfortunately, on the right, also on the left. And very much the same happened here. The 2016 election, the Republican Party was pretty much wiped out. It became the Trump Party, which actually serves the same masters, but not the individual who the establishment preferred. On the Democratic side, the most spectacular development was the Sanders movement. The first time in American political history that person who was basically unknown, no media support, no financial support from the wealth or corporate power, came very close to gaining the nomination, very well might have gained it. That's just a sharp break, and very similar to what's happening in Europe. Incidentally, also in Brazil, the center-right party, the party of the previous prime minister, Cardoso, disappeared, was totally wiped out. Instead, a neo-fascist extremist one. The party, the center-left, declined severely, partly its own fault, but it did under terrible attack. And out of this does grow morbid symptoms, the kind we were talking about. Xenophobia, racism, misogyny, hate crimes, and so on. And it could get more serious. I mentioned before something quite significant about the American political system. What made a certain amount of sense in the 18th century, with all of its severe flaws, the American constitutional system was a step forward. Plenty wrong with it. Well, big step forward by 18th century standards. Even the very phrase, "we the people," which was revolutionary at that time, putting aside how it was implemented, but the idea. You take a look today, that same political system is so regressive, it would not be accepted by, say, the European courts if a new country came in with that political system. And with the radical shift that's taking place, where already 60% senators are elected by states with 25% of the population. That means are elected by maybe 15% of the population, tendency that's growing, and a sharp split dividing. You can see it on the electoral map. Unless the Democrats can become what they once sort of were, a party of working people and the poor, at least to a large extent, unless that can happen, there may be some really severe morbid symptoms.
It sounds like you're putting your bets on the Democrats to reform.
No, I'm putting my bets on the public to compel the Democrats to reform, which is something quite different. And also to curb what the Republicans are doing. When I said the most dangerous organization in human history, I wasn't exaggerating. We have to bear that in mind. You can't find any organization in human history which is doing what the leadership is doing, knowingly, consciously moving towards imminent devastation in order to enrich a few super rich people. You can't find an analog to that.
Just a couple more questions. You doing okay?
Yeah.
Great. How do you reach people who are oblivious and impervious to facts?
By trying harder.
Do you even bother?
Oh yeah, you try harder. We're all human beings at bottom. First of all, you have to understand why. It's not just, I'm a moron. there are background reasons that have led to this situation. Now, some of them are pretty clear. For example, many of the working class people who voted for Trump voted for Obama. They didn't vote for Obama because they were racists. They voted for Obama because they believed his rhetoric about hope and change. I don't usually quote Sarah Palin, but she had a point when she asked, what happened to this hopey, changey business? Within a couple of years, people could perceive that the hope and change was nice, fancy rhetoric. Already by 2010, just 2 years after Obama's election, there was an election in Massachusetts, the most liberal state. The election was to replace Ted Kennedy, the liberal lion. The Republicans won the election, largely because even union workers were unwilling to get out and vote for Obama after what they'd seen. So that there's a background. There's a background for the reason why people are angry, very resentful, hating political institutions, easy prey for a con man. And if he tells them, I'm your hero, I'm defending you, and maybe they believe it, well, then they'll believe him when he says, don't believe the media. Don't listen to facts. Just listen to the facts are what Jared Kushner recently called false reality. Nice phrase. Yes, people are prey to that, but it's not their genes. It's circumstances that have created it, and those can be changed.
You've hinted at a couple of possibilities for political action. What else needs to be done in the next couple of years, given the eco-crisis that is about to envelop us?
Well, two major things have to be done. There are two truly existential threats cast a shadow over everything else. One is nuclear war, and we know how to reverse that. We can return to arms control treaties, in fact, much better ones. We can cut off the threat of possible war in Iran. There are very straightforward ways of doing that. It's going to take large-scale public pressure and activism, but that's within our reach. It's happened before. The activism of the 60s made it a much more civilized society. There's probably more people engaged today than there were then. And if they're organized and dedicated, they can achieve a lot. The second is ecological catastrophe. And we simply have to heed the warning of the IPCC, which, as I said, was soon after shown to be underestimated, and terminate the use of fossil fuels. These initiatives that were just voted down in the last election, they have to be instituted. People can institute them. They can carry out actions in many ways, from changing to LED bulbs, to using solar panels, to political action, and ultimately it really has to be on a massive scale. This also includes things we should not overlook it, like industrial meat production, which is extremely harmful in many ways, not even considering the animals. But one of the things it's doing is adding enormous amounts of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. All that can change. There are many ways to work. There's time to hold things back and reverse course. There also ought to be much more research and development on advanced technology. It's scandalous that solar technology is spearheaded in China, a poor country. That's where they're producing not only the great majority of the panels, but the most sophisticated ones. We have to look at things like decarbonization, many other things. So there's many directions in which activity has to proceed. And that's just the existential threats. When we talk about these other things, they're within grasp. In fact, I didn't pick up your reference to the maxim that Gramsci made famous. We should think about it seriously. We can have pessimism of the will, but pessimism of the intellect but we should have optimism of the will. That's our only hope.
Tell me about your visit to Lula in prison in Brazil. Why did you go, and what transpired?
Well, Valeria, my wife, and I, she's Brazilian, we went to Brazil in large part to become involved in the torrid political activities there before the election. And one of the first things we did was arrange to visit Lula in his prison, Curitiba, which is possible to do in a very limited way. He's allowed very limited visitors. And, at the time we visited him, it still looked hopeful that there might be a way to beat back this neo-fascist threat. Right now, it looks pretty horrible, but nothing's ever over.
Talk about the future of work in light of rapid strides in artificial intelligence and robotics. What are jobs going to look like in a few years?
Well, first of all, it's worth noticing that so far, at least, there is no real indication that robotics, although they're coming along, are having a really visible effect, detectable effect on jobs. If automation was really having a major effect, you would see it in productivity. The more working people are replaced by robots, the higher productivity measures. Productivity is extremely low. It's well below what it was in the 50s and the 60s. Now, this is coming. There's no doubt. It could be a very good thing, could be a very bad thing. Depends on how the technology is handled. If automation and robotics eliminates dangerous, boring, mind-destroying occupations and frees people to be more creative, independent, to pursue their own interests, to enhance their capabilities, even to have more leisure, that's all to the good. Speaking of leisure, Americans are enormously overworked by Western standards, by the standards of, given the wealth of society compared with others. Americans work 5 or 6 more weeks a year than Europeans, which is insane. So if robotics could have all of these effects, that's beneficial, but it depends who's going to have their hand on the lever. That could easily happen if an organized, engaged, activist population has their hand holding the lever. If the hand is private concentrations of power, it's going to be different and very ugly. But the technology doesn't care. The technology can be used for good or for ill.
There are young people in the audience in Denver and in Boulder. What advice would you give to them?
What advice? Optimism of the will. And support KGNU.
Finally, so many interviews seem to turn on this question of hope, and people are curious about you personally in terms of what inspires you.
What inspires me is things like the fact that, say, right here, there's a lively activist community. It's lasted for a long time. The Community Radio Center is an energizing force. There are things like this all over. As I mentioned, the Sanders campaign broke with well over a century of American political history. That's pretty impressive. And the offshoots of it are active, effective, doing lots of things. They're very important. The younger people entering the political system, like Ocasio-Cortez and others. And there were defeats in this election, but there were victories too. And we should, as I say, remember what the past was. It wasn't very long ago that the United States had laws which were a model for Nazi Germany. In the late 60s, As late as the 1960s, the U.S. had anti-miscegenation laws so severe that when the Nazis were developing the Nuremberg laws, their racist laws, and looking for precedents, they did pick the American laws. They were the only ones they could find. But the American laws were too severe for them. The Nazis weren't willing to go as far as the one drop of blood requirement. That was the 1960s. As late as 15 years ago, we had anti-sodomy laws. Think about as late as 1975, women were not considered peers in the legal system. It was only in 1975 that the Supreme Court guaranteed the right of women to serve as peers in federal juries. It was one part of a very substantial change. Enormous changes took place through the activism of largely young people against many barriers, much harsher barriers than today, and a lot was achieved. There was a harsh reaction. The neoliberal period is in many ways a reaction to that. But we start now from a higher plane. We have the legacy of those past achievements, and plenty of people are taking advantage of it. That's plenty of reasons for hope.
And saving the most difficult question for this right now. What famous intellectual activist was born in Philadelphia on December 7th, 1928, turning 90 years old?
Well, if you look at his birth certificate, it says Noam Chomsky, because this is a sign of the change of the times. The name is Avram Noam, but some clerk couldn't believe it, so he crossed the name out in pencil and changed Noam to Naomi and Avram to Avrain, because women are allowed to have crazy names, not men. That wouldn't happen now.
Well, on behalf of everyone here at Noam Chomsky, thank you so much for joining us and supporting community radio.
It's my pleasure.